introductions as people get on, and then we'll start, because we try and make this 1 hour. And for those of you who have been here every week, you know the setting. For those of you who are new, just remind you why we're doing it, why we do this, and what we're doing this. We are going to record this session, just so everybody knows this, but it's we decided in almost a year ago. My goodness, it's 12 months goes fast sometimes. That we would meet every Tuesday at 4 o'clock as a community, Merrick School, faculty, staff, students, just as sort of a former community. So people would kind of a forum to come to, where it wasn't in your class, it wasn't a faculty meeting or administrators meeting. It was more a way of sort of binding together, and gives a chance in the early stages to complain about our kids. We never complained about our spouses, I have to say that. But it's living together. But it's and then we decided that we would last semester, we decided we'd continue to do that. It was sort of useful, but we would do it with sort of a purpose, and looking at what was really going on in business, because we had discussed that sort of informally in our sessions. What was really going on in business in the pandemic, and what was the kind of nature? Could we forecast what the nature of business was going to be post-pandemic? And we saw this as tremendously important. It's tremendously important obviously for our faculty, because we're constantly looking at our curriculum and we want to teach what's relevant. But it's also very important for our students for two reasons. One is that our students are building their careers, and that's why they're at the Merrick School. And so having an idea about what that world is like should be good indicators of where to build your career. But also, I find this several times. We're not agents, sort of agents where this is happening to us. As our students go out there, and we can create things, and we can create this business world that we want for the future. And so this is why we bring in speakers. And so we bring in a guest. The format is very simple. I'm going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes with our guest. I'm going to introduce her in just a second. And then we're going to split into small groups for about 15, 20 minutes. And then, I'm going to ask you to post questions. I'm going to curate that, and we'll have a discussion with our speaker. And I'm really happy to be able to introduce our speaker for today, who's Carlyle Singer from the Acumen. And I'm not sure, I hope that you've had a chance to look at who Acumen are. Acumen is certainly it's got a very dedicated mission to applying entrepreneurship and investment really to change people's lives. And we're going to have a lot of chances to talk about that in a second. And you're going to have to excuse me for 1 second, because for the first time, one of the things that just happened in my previous meeting I was in, out of frustration, I closed down a file where I've got, Carlyle, I've got your bio in front of you. And so I'm going to have to, I'm sorry about this. So I can get it exactly right, I'm just going to pull it up again. Sorry. And so we are going to talk about Acumen because it's an organization which I think is very interesting in what they're doing in terms of using the power of entrepreneurship and investment. And it's evolved over the years around these areas, really to make a difference in people's lives, particularly in
Murray just went on mute.
Yeah, this happened last week. Something is happening here. So I come up, so trying to change people's lives. So Carlyle has been at Acumen since 2013. She's currently the president. Acumen, as you probably will see, is a worldwide organization. So Carlyle supports management function right across the organization, the country directors, as well as the functional heads who charge of their areas. They call the areas expansion, legal, finance, talent, operations. Carlyle's got great business experience before joining Acumen. She was president and CEO of Catton Corporation, which is I think it's still a privately held global but middle market company in the consumables imaging space, OEM compatible, I think they call themselves, consumables imaging space. And during our tenure of that company, our real focus was really on development and execution of strategies that would sort of change it in, again, a rapidly changing industry. And prior to that, Carlyle was with Catton, which is Catton. Is that how you pronounce it?
It's Catton.
Sorry, prior to with Catton, you were with Icon Office Solutions, which was bought by Ricoh. It's a publicly held company, and Carlyle was a senior vice president of operations, vice president, corporate controller, president of Econ France, so global experience. Carlyle is an MBA graduate from Stanford University. As I tell audience frequently, Carlyle, not everybody can get into the University of Baltimore. So, but it's and she has undergraduate degree from Harvard, which is a very good college, by the way. All right, so I recommend it. Concentration was in Latin in history, with a degree in history with concentration in Latin American economic development. So, so Carlyle, welcome, and really happy to have you. Maybe just to set, so we got a level playing field with everybody. It might be useful just to. I gave a brief description of Acumen, but just tell, maybe, if you want to fill in my description so everybody's on the same page about who Acumen is and the range of places you cover and the range of portfolio companies that you support and the activities that you support at the moment, just so people have got a kind of an idea of that. And then really we'll get into our main focuses. All right, so you've got this worldwide organization, what happened in the pandemic. So first of all, just the shape of where Acumen is today and what it's doing.
Sure, thanks, Murray, and also thank you always for supporting Acumen. So we are deeply appreciated as a partner. So Acumen started in 2001, so this is our 20th year anniversary. That's a big step, and we are going to take a look back on 20 years of impact investing for us, which means really using the tools of market forces to solve problems for the poor. I mean, Jacqueline Novogratz, who started the organization, started with the concept of trying to find an alternative to aid. Which aid was creating dependence, dealing with the poor as customers, giving them the dignity that frankly they deserved, and not creating dependence. So it wasn't just aid, it was also changing philanthropy, that you could actually, when you compared what Acumen could do with philanthropy, Acumen could create a business, and that business would be, if you succeeded, a going concern. And so what impact you had would be an impact that would continue to grow over time and be sustaining over time. So very, very different from a charitable contribution where you would have a one-time shot to provide books to a certain community to read, and then that was what you did, and there was that was all that you did. So an alternative to aid was the motivation, building out a different model for philanthropy, and it existed in an uncomfortable place, and frankly, I think still does, which is between philanthropy and venture capital. Trying to marry the best of philanthropy, which is actually a long-term approach and a desire to solve a problem for the poor, and the rigor and the discipline of the private sector, which creates going concerns that actually can scale. And once it scales, your impact scales. It is really impact first, and has always been impact first, has always steadfastly stayed in a focus to solve a problem for the poor. Over time, it started from New York, realized very quickly that you needed to have local people on the ground to identify, opportunities of emerging entrepreneurs that were innovating and thinking about the poor in this way, and so expanded to East Africa, India, and Pakistan. Mm-hmm. And existed with that footprint for quite some time. In 2011, went to West Africa, so now covered Sub-Saharan Africa. 2013, the year I got here, we started Latin America. 2015, we took on America, a completely different capital market, if you will, completely different set of problems, but certainly poverty and real opportunities to actually do what we did everywhere else, and even import some of the things that we had learned in other countries in developing economies into a developed economy. In 2015, we did a strategy piece of work to really be more focused. So when Acumen started, impact investing was a new thing, and Acumen is actually credited with being somewhat of a pioneer in impact investing. It certainly has taken on its own momentum and become significantly more mainstream. The area that we focus on, this area of in between, and really focused on the poor, hasn't gotten as much capital. So, and in the beginning, there weren't that many companies. So the strategy was really to find whatever company you could and prove out a model, prove that you actually could solve a problem in this way. By 2015, we decided to focus in 4 areas, which is health, workforce development and education, energy, and agriculture. Where we have had the greatest success in terms of creating a system, almost shifting a market, has been in off-grid energy in sub-Saharan Africa. We started with a company called Delight, and even before that, an emerging company called Mcopa, and have now in using this early stage philanthropic capital, we have actually 21 companies in our portfolio, and have really learned an enormous amount about what models work, what models don't work. But even beyond the investing, which over time many of these companies will be successful, we have become a voice and an agent of change in that space. So using our investing to create knowledge, to create a voice, to shift things, has started to be what we've been working on of late. You can see it in the US, where we have a real focus on health. Robert Wood Johnson is one of our biggest funders. They're a powerful player, have really helped us in our evolution. We have 13 or 14 companies, I think, at this point in various stages, and are now going to build a collaborative with Medicaid leaders to start to talk through what it would take to really change, how we could use these companies, how we could use what we've learned with these companies to start to really drive a conversation of change. So we continue to evolve and change. That's part of what Acumen really stands for. Make it experimental, sort of a laboratory. I think the final thing I would say is, if you're thinking about just this investment piece that Acumen does, what we do is take innovative models in very difficult places, and we de-risk those models to the point that private capital can come in and scale them. So it's uncomfortable to use philanthropy, except the bold statement we rarely make is that this is not an economic model. The costs are very high. It takes way too long for these models to sort themselves out, and the returns aren't compelling. Our greatest success for a return is 2.98x. Who's going to get excited about that? Now, if you start to look at the return, if you could quantify, if people would assign a value to impact, it would be 9, 10, 15x. It would be impressive, but that today is not in a quantified world. And the final, I guess, thing I would say, and I'll turn it back over to you, Murray, is from the beginning, we've wanted to keep ourselves very honest about measuring impact. That is not easy. We started with something called BACO, which was the best alternative to a charitable contribution. And that was interesting, but not substantive enough. Then we started collecting a bunch of metrics. Through Andy, we created IRIS, which still exists today. And we use some of those metrics, but we moved to a methodology enabled by technology and mobile phones of surveying the customers. We call it lean data. And we survey the customers to understand their poverty level and the change that this intervention, whether it's a service or a product, has made in their lives. So depth and breadth of this change, poverty level, depth, and breadth. Breadth is just lives, but everybody measures lives. And have subsequently spun that out as an independent entity. It's a for-profit, it's a B Corp, and it is doing this measurement across multiple different impact investors with the hope that this methodology will become part of the standard of measuring impact, and that there will be benchmarks by sector in terms of, you know, and again, in energy, we have the best and greatest amount of data, but that we start to push this impact investing into a world where there's data that supports and quantifies what the impact is. Our hope being that once we do that, there will be more money. It won't be just a story, but there'll be more money that will come to address issues of poverty, because it will be quantified impact and you will be able to compare it to other types of impact. That's in its early stages. I think, Murray, you probably know when we spun it out. These all merged together, but I think we spun it out in 2019. Right. 2020 was its first year, and it's growing rapidly. So I think that's a broad brushstroke where we are, except geographically, we're Pakistan today, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, particularly in Colombia post-conflict, and then America.
And just to clarify, the 21, there's 21 portfolio companies in the energy, the off-grid. Is that was right?
That's right.
Right.
11.
How many portfolio companies do you think, and how many companies?
Total that are active today. A total cumulative is 136. Total that are active today is, and this, don't quote me because I'll be in the neighborhood, but I won't be exactly right. I think 85.
Right. So that's great. That's there's a wide span, and this is actually very thinking about the pandemic and business and the pandemic. If I was able to move, because I think there's a privileged place here. We've done a lot of exploration. Not say we've concentrated, just focused just in the U.S., because we have had some guests who have had global businesses. But I think you're the first guest that we have who's got businesses or got exposure to businesses that are really in the front line of in emerging territories, or even in the U.S. and quite challenged places. As the pandemic evolved, I mean, what were you seeing, and particularly, what you were seeing about businesses that were able to pivot successfully, and those that were maybe been more challenged. Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. So first of all, the biggest thing that we knew when the pandemic started was that we've been working with the poor for 19 years. Our companies had access to some of the most vulnerable people, and so we actually raised separate funds, and for the first time gave grants very, very quickly to help those companies serve their customers or clients. We had access that lots of people didn't have. And so that's a fundamental theory. If you think about, so that's number one. Number two, big statement, but no company failed in our portfolio because of COVID. I mean, we did a lot of work to stand behind our companies so that they wouldn't fail. That isn't to say that we didn't have a couple of failures in 2020. We did. Had nothing to do with COVID. They were on their way out anyway. Just an important kind of concept. To give you some examples, one of the biggest pivots was, I'll give you just an example of pivots. Lots of our companies pivoted to deal with the humanitarian issues they were seeing. A company that is in India, run by one of our fellows who makes sanitary pads, she has an interesting model because it's a distributed manufacturing model. And contrary to what everybody would do, she created the equipment. She's an engineer. She'd take that equipment into a small village, and she would put some women into business. They would buy the machine from her, and they would make and distribute sanitary napkins under their own brand. So she didn't even keep the brand. Her whole value add is actually the equipment. She shifted her model to make masks immediately. She retooled this equipment to teach and get out there capacity to make masks in all these extremely remote villages. So this is what I mean about having access. So there's switching your asset base, if you will, to adapt to what COVID was needing. We have multiple smaller enterprises in education, in providing education, access to education. or access to programs for schools to manage themselves better. All of them had to switch to delivering their content online. So that was another very big switch. We have product companies, coffee product as an example. We have chocolate companies. We have fresh, in Latin America, we have organic vegetables, end-to-end organic vegetables. And many of those, all three of those companies had restaurants that shut down. A big piece in Colombia of this organic vegetable company was actually their revenue was based on restaurants. That revenue went to zero sort of almost immediately. They had to convert and build out e-commerce, find a partner for e-commerce, build it out. Likewise in Peru, a healthy snacks company. They still maintained their business in the supermarkets, but it was spotty opening, closing. They had to start to build out the channel in e-commerce. Our coffee company roasts coffee, sells green coffee, roasts coffee, and has a cafe chain, and the cafe chain's closed, had to develop takeout. So I think lots of these adjustments that you see are adjustments that you saw, all around you. You saw your restaurants around you go into takeout just as ours did. In the US, we have a company that has a fast food chain for healthy food. And obviously, and they have a very interesting model. It's a centralized kitchen where it's called Every Table, where they deliver out to their locations the meals that are ready made. You pick them up, you put them in the microwave, or you take it home, put it in the microwave, or there's a microwave there, you put it in the microwave, you eat it. It's targeted food deserts, areas where the poor live, and there's nothing but very unhealthy fast food. Obviously, their restaurants shut down overnight, but they again looked at their asset base, and their asset base was this centralized kitchen. And so they started to produce meals and deliver them to the elderly. And then they went to the California state and said, can you pay us? Can you give us a contract? So they started by doing this, providing the meals, and then they got a contract from the state. We then funded them to provide them meals to youth at risk. And then they went to the state and got a contract to deliver those meals. So they converted their entire model and put on this separate business in terms of government contracts to the needy, if you will. And today, as restaurants are opening back up, they now have a two-pronged model that they are working with. So I think the message across the board is what is your service and what are your assets, and how do you convert them to continue to stay in business? And we saw an enormous amount of creativity in our companies that were able to do that.
So that's before I break into groups. I want to sort of zero in on one thing about Acumen and the kind of structure here, because am I right here? I mean, it sounds like your businesses were portfolio companies were by and large with ones that would have, I think you said, they probably have gone down and they would probably have failed anyway. But in the pandemic, I'm hearing a big picture of different types of pivots that they find to do, from changing the product mix to changing the supply chain or the method of a delivery. So you mentioned you gave small grants to support them with their customers. What other, what else is involved in this that gives that kind of success? Because that sounds a great success story. I mean, what else is in the Acumen package that is sort of helping these businesses become, it sounds like, quite resilient, I think.
I think that's right. I think part of it was capital. To be fair, we gave $50,000 grants and in some cases up to $100,000 of a very forgiving loan. No payment for the first year, interest only for the second year. Third year, you started to make payments. We didn't give that many, but the total, I think, to our portfolio base was something like 1.2 million. Not huge sums. I think part of the package, Murray, is that we really believe in staying close and deep, what we call deep accompaniment. For instance, in Every Table, we put somebody that we've known for years, a private equity guy, on the board, and also we have one of our co-funders at Acumen America. So one of our more senior people helping that company, and they were talking to him daily during this crisis. Brainstorming on what could be doing, using their joint contacts, talking to Kaiser, who ended up investing. So there's this very, when it works, and I would say it doesn't always work. So I'm not idealistic in that sense. We have a really strong relationship, and we are the type of organization, when the going gets tough, we're right there. We're not scared. We're trying to find solutions. We're trying to help them find solutions. And so that comes with the territory that we've been dealing with for years. So that's part of the DNA within Acumen, because we deal in very difficult circumstances all the time. This was an unheard of crisis, but our team knows how to accompany in hard times because they've been doing it.
So you partly answered a question that I posted. I'm going to create the questions when we come back, but partly answered a question that Heather, thanks for the question, Heather Duggan asked about whether you bring your own on-the-ground people or infrastructure to the situation, or is it better to use the locals? And I think, we can come back to this question afterwards, but it sounds like, it's a combination of both. It's, on the ground, you're very close to the people on the ground, they're doing it, but are able to call in a wider network of expertise and some capital, limited capital to,
right.
when needed.
That's right.
That's a powerful model. Now, to keep this going, I'm going to divide people into small groups. People are tired of me telling you come every week that I haven't quite mastered, the Zoom way of allocating people to groups. So it's totally random. And I always say this, if you're a new student or new faculty member hasn't been here, there's no academic standing here. Okay, everybody's equal. Okay, and I'm going to Carlyle, you'll go randomly into group as well, and if you don't mind, and we'll spend about 15-20 minutes in the group. I'd like you to sort of come up with a set of questions about the nature of Acumen's business, questions that might interest you about what has happened in these countries, particularly thinking about this is in some of the more challenged areas of the US, as well as in Colombia, Peru, Pakistan, South Asia, Pakistan and India particularly, and sub-Saharan Africa. What's happening there in terms of what's happened in the pandemic, and also what we see as what's going to happen to business afterwards, what's going to happen to this model, what's going to happen to these businesses after as they go around. These are the kind of things that we should be discussing. So I'm going to divide this up into groups, and this is we're going to be in about 9 groups. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to send you a couple of prods, and then everybody will come back. Introduce yourselves when you get there, and then start discussing what kind of questions to come back. I've got a few already, which I'll curate as well, add them in. Okay. Let me curate these as I go along. Okay, just in case I, just point out to me what I'm. Is there things?
If everybody can mute their microphones.
Okay. I'm going to start off, Carlyle, with one, while these are coming up, that we're getting one. It came from one of my faculty members, but it was about more about the way Acumen operates when you're looking at entrepreneurs. To what extent, when you're looking at entrepreneurs, and your things are competencies important their competencies and what they bring to the role as opposed to their knowledge about, you know, the hard stuff of business, you know, like accounting or legal or these kind of things. I mean, how would you see that?
We just had a conversation because I had 2 accounting majors in my group, and I just basically said how common it is for entrepreneurs not to invest in accounting systems and processes at the right time. They delay because they think it's expendable, and then the catch up is quite painful. And so I think, look, we look very seriously at the skills of the team. It's unusual for us to have just one person. It's usually a team, and you know, at the very least 2 partners, sometimes 3 or 4. Not all partners, but there's a team that's been built out, and we think about where they need to be supplemented, but we don't expect the team to be fully baked and have all the skills that they need. That would be absolutely unrealistic. What we do expect is that they are values aligned with Acumen. They care about solving a problem for the poor. That's very clear. And they're not in it strictly for profit. That can create a lot of dissonance in conversations. We've actually had situations where we had a board with a pure for-profit venture person and then Acumen, and even that created an enormous amount of dissonance for our entrepreneurs. So values alignment, solving a problem, values alignment, and then we assess the skills and where it needs to be supplemented. And sometimes we say, well, we don't want to put in the money unless you agree to hire XYZ, you know, so a CFO as an example. Mm-hmm. So, but that's how we look at it. We don't expect a full complement of competencies, of hard skills.
Good. Now I'm going to go. There's three questions in this one, but they're really probably kind of core. It came from David Lingo back, was in group 1. But how has Acumen's philosophy changed due to the pandemic? That's the first question, and then there's a couple of follow-ons from that. But yeah, actually, maybe just start with that so I don't confuse you too much, and then I'll follow up with these other 2, and then I'm going to pull them in with a couple of other questions. Okay, so how your philosophy changed due to the pandemic?
So that's a good question. I think there's one important. I think the pandemic has forced us all to reevaluate our business model, if you will. And Acumen, way back in 2001, started by giving grants, and very early on decided that it would not give grants. And why? They felt, and I think rightly so, that putting in an equity or debt drove the rigor and the discipline that would prepare a company to bring in other capital, and that was hugely important. That sense of accountability and responsibility was very, very important. And so they haven't done grants since then. In response to, as I said before, to the pandemic, we decided to go back and do grants. We discussed it. It's very risky. We felt it was risky for Acumen to do that. Acumen is known as an investor. We've been very clear that it isn't even soft capital. We're rigorous when we go in. We're very demanding. And so now we were suddenly going to go back and do grants. And was that going to confuse the market about who we were? So we decided to only do $50,000 level grants. That was the top of the amount that we would give. And we were very, very clear about the criteria for those grants. So we turned down a lot of grant requests. And so that was different for us. We did it in a very specific way. We're just finishing out putting that capital out. So it's been, we raised it and started in May. And so it's February and we're giving our last grants out now. And we had very strict, impact reporting that is starting to come in. So that's a big change on how we responded. And we gave grants not just to our companies, but we have a fellows program where we're training social entrepreneurs and leaders that want to, make change in the world. And we gave grants to them. Sometimes grants they're running nonprofits. We actually supported quite a few nonprofits in this process. So radically different for Acumen, very much tied up in a box so that we could say this is COVID and it's over and this is not who we are going forward. But that was a very big shift. There's another shift, which was we're in this fellowship training now called Acumen Academy, where we're sharing our knowledge and training leaders. And that program was all in person, and we had to take all that curriculum and put it online and deliver it online. So we had to shift our business model in training these Acumen fellows, of which there are about 750 in the world at this point, all doing, most of them, I would say 80% of them, doing work to make change in their communities.
And that,
So those
now
are two
that-
big
that-
adaptations.
That's great. That group also asked a question, which I see repeated in a couple of other questions about how you connect with people. So there's another question, expanding how you connect people from that question. Do you have a process to connect people, companies that invest in around the world such they can share experience or resources and they don't reinvent the wheel everywhere?
So I love that question. I would say, I think that's, we're now looking at our next 10 years, and I think that's the biggest gap in our model right now. So have we informally connected? Yes. Do we have a sector expert in energy, and one that we had and will replace in agriculture? Yes. That continue to try to share knowledge informally through our teams, who would share them through to the CEOs. But what we have not done and what we will do is actually codify. We're now going to take a look back for the last 20 years, what we have learned in this impact investing space. Again, we probably have one of the largest portfolios, certainly the only portfolio that's dedicated to solving problems of the poor. And we're going to look back and say, what have been our successes? What were the elements that made that success? Where were the failures? Hard to talk about failures usually when they happen, because you're throwing an entrepreneur on the bus, you're throwing somebody under the bus. And so, but now we have enough failures that are far enough back historically, we can actually talk about them, just change the names. And so what are our failures? And what is the, and we're building now a group which is going to, which has, 2 or 3, I think, consulting type skills that can draw out our learnings and now have this be something that we do on an ongoing basis. We used to write business cases way back before I got to Acumen. We're starting now with our chocolate company, going to write our first business case. Again, this one will be owned by Harvard, but in the future we'll write our own so that they don't own our unique, content, essentially knowledge content. But I think it's the best question, because I think it's an area where this model has been vulnerable. We've been so busy doing that we've been not as good at sharing and not as good at putting that knowledge out into the world, so people can learn the elements of success. People can learn from the multiple mistakes that we've made. And we're a philanthropic organization. That's part of what we really should be doing all the time.
And that partly answers the question. Heather Duggan also asked, great questions. And I think, you've answered part of that when you were talking about, how some of your funding models changed during the pandemic. But also Heather had asked, can these skills where we're learning can these skills be translatable to expansion into new markets? And I would sort of tie that in with a question that one of our business guests, Frank Noate, asks, did your experience with Acumen International help Acumen US do things differently, or vice versa? I mean, so I think it's kind of expanding on that kind of question of, what are you learning? Okay.
Right. So there's a lot of different things that we've learned. One is that expansion into new areas has been difficult. We thought we would find successful models and replicate them in other geographies. We've not successfully done that yet. On the other hand, we have expanded into new geographies with people that have then, identified issues, found entrepreneurs, and launched the model. So I'm not sure I understood really the first part of that question, Mara. The second part of the question is, what are there things that we learned the developing world that were appropriate for the developed world? And and the answer is yes. And I'll give you one example, which is community health. I mean, there are models in the developing world on community health that have been transported. This is actually not a company we've invested in yet, but has that in Harlem, has a model that is based very much like community health models that we've seen in Africa and in India. So we have seen things that, and she happens to come from one of those areas and has transported that model to Harlem, and very successfully. Started as a not-for-profit, and she's now converting herself into a for-profit. But she takes community members, trains them to go house to house to house, and dealing with, diabetes or these diseases where regular interventions make a big difference and actually save hospital visits. And she's supported by a platform, and that's a model that will now become. But that is a model that comes not from the U.S., comes from elsewhere. So there are models that we have seen elsewhere that we see could be imported to the U.S. successfully.
And another question that's come up is, have any of the portfolio companies, I think the way the question is phrased is, has gone mainstream. I guess,
I don't know what mainstream means.
Yeah,
That's a judgment call, right? So do we? So look, Delight is our shining example of a success, and it started off selling solar lanterns for, at the time, what was $35. Today, that same solar lantern, it's 12 years later. It's almost 12 years later, is $9. They started in India. They've ended up being a powerhouse in the off-grid solar world in Africa. And they reached 100 million in revenue and 100 million lives. So that, for us, real success. And we have started to exit. Taking our equity dollars out has been hugely challenging in these markets. There aren't secondary buyers. These are undeveloped capital markets, and that company is still growing. So all investors don't want to take out an existing investor. They want their capital used for growth. So you end up in a very difficult situation in terms of getting your money out. Another shining example, but again, is it mainstream? Not sure you could consider it mainstream, is a chicken farm in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, which is, if you've been following what's going on there, has been politically unstable and difficult. They started in partnership with the government. They took over a failing chicken farm that the government owned, changed the breed twice. And at the point in time that they were absolutely failed, all their chickens had died. And yet they had figured out the one breed that tasted like they needed it to taste, or two breeds actually. We gave them a loan. Nobody else would give them any money. And we gave them an $800,000 loan, which shows you how we're impact first. Because you had them right where you wanted them. You could have taken all their ownership. You could have owned the entire company if you wanted to. We just gave them a loan. We wanted to protect their ownership. They turned out to be enormously successful. They have 1,000 employees. 99% of them are Ethiopian. They have developed an entire channel themselves. So they have agents that take the chicks, keep them for the 45 days required when the chicks are very vulnerable. They provide the feed package, all the vaccinations to the agents, then the agents go sell them to the smallholder farmers. And as you guys probably know, livestock is one of the best ways to protect smallholder farmers and diversify their income streams. They've changed the nutritional composition of the Tigray region, which had a lot of stunting, and that stunting percentage has gone down something like 11 points, like 45 to 34. I'd get my data wrong because it's been a while, but they now are taking that same model into Rwanda, and they're going to go straight across sub-Saharan Africa. So the first, and we have now funded them in our for-profit fund. It's under a different name. It's not Ethio Chicken anymore. It's called Uzima. But now this is a veritable model that we know works and is now going to spread across sub-Saharan Africa. We consider that a shining example of success. Is it mainstream? I don't know. I don't think today we could say, by the way, most people use that word, none of it's mainstream, because poverty and business is not mainstream. People using the tools of business to solve problems of poverty is just not something that's mainstream. I don't know if that's a good
But
answer, but it's kind of the answer.
Well, that's also good for, this is my second, there's a host of other questions, by the way, but I think we've got time for just two questions. And this is the second last one. And the last one is, I get to ask the last question, but it's but there's been a couple of questions to say a little bit more about the impact metrics that you use, and maybe provide maybe a little bit more examples of the impact metrics you use, and maybe maybe you can actually, we can put our heads together, something that is coming from one of our faculty members who's teaching on the social entrepreneurship course, maybe some resources that we can give students as well about this as well to expand it. So, but say a little bit more about, how you measure impact and and how you track that.
Yeah, I mean, look, before we make an investment, we had what is now called 60 decibels. So 60 dB, which is the decibel level of the human voice. So that's how you can remember it. And you can look them up, and that's a resource. They're wonderful people, and they all used to work for Acumen. And they certainly will be happy to give you an education and talk to you about it. But before we invest, we do a very light look at to try and kind of take where we are, where that company is in terms of impact. And is their model actually having impact to the best of our knowledge? And then a year or 2 years later, depending on the company and depending on the growth, we take another look. We actually, survey their client base or their customer base for the level of poverty that we're reaching. And we're reaching, and we think we have probably the greatest focus of anyone, on average about 40%. Our highest poverty level companies are in agriculture. Some of our lowest ones are in financial inclusion, so they grow really fast. Pagatech in West Africa, Nigeria, very, very large growth, very large reach. Under 10% of them are poor, but that's a very big number because they're a financial platform, a financial tech platform. So we do an intervention before we invest. We then subsequently do one or 2 years later, and then 2 years after that. And we're trying to measure, it depends on the sector, what we're trying to measure. So our deepest impact, and this is a report that we can share, has been on energy, off-grid energy, and where we measured, I think, 11 companies against 12 or 15 metrics in our survey, and then did a spider chart. So if you wanted a company that actually increased income the most, this was the company that did it. If you wanted one that was really about where safety was the big issue, then here's the company that did it. So we were able to compare and contrast relatively similar off-grid solar company models and actually, find out which ones did better in which way. A big thing for us is, of course, resilience of the poor. And so increase in income is something that we measure very much so on the agriculture side, but even here in the energy side. If you look at cook stoves, if you're using less wood because you're burning a very efficient cook stove, that's saving you money. If you're moving into a solar power for your cooking, then that's even more money that you're saving, et cetera, et cetera. So the issue we have is sector by sector or subsector by sector, we can compare companies across. We can ask them the same questions and we can have data that can compare across. The problem is to create a system in which, whether it's in energy or it's in education, which is very hard to measure, or it's in agriculture, or it's in health, how do you create a system that allows you to choose, you the donor, if you will, or the investor, that allows you to choose one that's, this is a very high impact, this is a very low impact, because the impacts are different, and they're so different by sector. So that's the challenge. And what we want to get away from is measuring impact by anecdote, by stories. So we can give you data for each company, and within a sector, we're starting to get quite a bit of data. But how we make that into an overall benchmark that people can use to measure, that's the challenge across the board. And 60 decibels is our voice in the space that is really thinking about the metrics. And there's an impact group, and again, 60 decibels can tell you what it is, where they're really looking at 3 or 4 of the metrics that come from the customer, which is our customer voice, 60 decibels, and 4 or 5 other metrics to try and create a standard across, so that every time you're looking at a social impact company, you're looking at, 7 metrics, and it's the same 7 metrics. They might say slightly different things in the customer voice piece, but you'll have some consistency. So that's work that's currently going on. It's really hard. It's a hard space. It has evolved a lot, and it's continuing to evolve.
That's great. So this is my last, my last question, and then we do one more thing before we finish quickly. But this is, as I said earlier on, our students are here shaping their careers, and they're, so I wonder, this would be advice to them about as they go out into this new world, this post-COVID world, what they need to bring in order to be successful. I mean, obviously, this is important for our faculty because we should be, we should be developing our programs so that they make our students successful. So what do our students need in order to be successful in this new world?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think what they need to do, what I would recommend, and I think we're all doing this, is that we all have to redefine what success means, and to ourselves personally, and then obviously extend it to drive whatever organization or however you decide to interact in this ever evolving world that we're in. And for us, I think there's an issue of purpose, of course. There's an issue of fairness with employees. We can go down the list and say, this is what we mean at Acumen and what we have defined as what a redefined success actually means. And it's beyond the sort of the catchy word of shareholder value versus stakeholder value. It's like, these are the things that we consider important values that should be within an organization. And so I think that if I were a student in today's world, I would be glad to know that there are options beyond really traditional business that is for-profit only, that there is an expanding world. Where you fit in that spectrum is about your own it's a personal decision. And I, was in the for-profit world for 35 years. So I considered my whole career to be super valuable. That's not the point. And so it doesn't matter what you choose. It does matter in terms of knowing where you are on the spectrum and what you want out of it. And I think that that's the most important thing to know in terms of determining your own success. It's not about how other people define success. It's about how you define success. So I guess that's my big advice to students, is define what success means for you. The world has many more options, and it's how you define it that is going to drive where you go.
Well, thank you very much. Before we finish on the last thing, where I just want to remind people that we have our next session is not next week, but it's I'm correct, Danielle, the 2nd of March, and it's our guest then is going to be Andrew Friedman, and some of you may know Andrew. He's been teaching here in the past, but he also runs a consulting firm, and he's just published a book on high performance cultures. So we're going to have a sort of challenging conversation about high performance cultures, and particularly in the new world and different worlds. So I think you'll enjoy that. Of course, faculty and students, we still meet next week. We have a kind of community meeting, and everybody is welcome to that as well. So, and our tradition to end these, Carlyle, I want to personally thank you for spending the time. But today our chair of our Dean's Advisory Council, Laura Newman, she wants to say a few words of thanks on behalf of the whole community. So Laura, I'll give it over to you.
Murray, thank you. Carlyle, wow. Wow, that sums it up. But I'm going to go a little further than that and say we are extremely grateful for your time. I particularly found it interesting that you're not just doing investment, but you've built this online education platform and leadership development. It is a global perspective to changing the world. And, you truly inspire all of us. We all want to make a difference, and Acumen is doing that. So thank you for taking your time today to be with us. We're really grateful for it.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. We'll give a digital clap, okay? I'm sorry I didn't get everybody's questions, but it was a great session. So thank you again. And we'll see everybody hopefully in 2 weeks' time. We'll have another session. Thank you.
Bye, and thanks,
Bye.
Murray.
Thank you very much, Carlyle. Thank you. Okay.